I want to welcome you back to our study in the book of Acts. In our last lesson, in chapter 6, of course, Luke in that chapter highlights a struggle that had arisen in the early church. There were some widows among the Christian families that weren't being taken care of. And the apostles, of course, dealt with that struggle by appointing certain men to take care of that task. And of course, that left the apostles free to devote themselves to preaching and prayer, their primary tasks. And so we discussed that, and it's a great plan. Worked out, of course, for the benefit. Luke mentions the growth and the spread of the church, even in the midst of those kind of things. One of the seven servants selected there was a man named Stephen. In the last half of chapter 6 in the book of Acts deals with him not only helping in the distribution of the food to the widows, but he was also out preaching and proclaiming Christ, and that gets him in trouble. And of course, that follows a pattern we've seen throughout all of the chapters in the first part of Acts. The apostles themselves have been arrested and confronted. Now Stephen is going to endure some of that same problem. Stephen's defense here in chapter 7 of Acts is the longest discourse in the book itself. It is a selective recital of Old Testament history, including sections on Abraham, Joseph, and Moses, and toward the end, speaking of the falling away of Israel. Stephen's defense here was cut short when he applies his history lesson to Israel's present rejection of the Messiah. And of course, that set the leadership off, and ultimately they take Stephen's life by stoning him to death. Stephen here, though, responds to the charges made against him at the end of chapter 6 by turning them on his accusers. They, you see, were the real ones who were disobeying God because of their rejection of God's appointed leaders. We'll pick up in verse 1 of chapter 7. Please follow along in your Bibles and study along with me, if you would, please. Acts chapter 7 in verse 1, it says, "The high priest said, 'Are these things so?'" If you go back to chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, last time we read these words. It says, "They put forward false witnesses who said, 'This man incessantly speaks against this holy place and the law. For we've heard him say that this Nazarene Jesus will destroy this place and alter the customs which Moses handed down to us.'" And those are serious charges. And Stephen here is given an opportunity to answer those charges which were leveled against him. The high priest isn't named here in verse 1, but it's probably Caiaphas. He was the one, of course, that was viewed as high priest by the Romans, although Annas was still viewed by many of the Jews as the official high priest. Anyway, it's likely Caiaphas here because this probably takes place before AD 36 when he left office. So once again, the name isn't given, but that's who we're probably dealing with there. Verse 2 says, "And he said," here's the start of Stephen's defense. "And he said, 'Hear me, brethren and fathers. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you.' Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living." So again, Stephen begins his response here to his brothers and the fellow Jews with a response to a reference to the God of glory. The idea is that God possesses glory. It's inherent, if you will, in his being. This unique reference to God here in the book of Acts, I think it's the only place in the New Testament where this specific phrase is used, begins Stephen's speech on a note of high respect for the one Stephen is ultimately being accused of blaspheming. God is unique and characterized by glory. You can find the phrase in other places in the Old Testament, like Psalm 29, verse 3, Exodus 16, verse 10, and Exodus 24, verses 16 through 17. It's either God of glory there or the glorious God, something like that. It's interesting to note, we won't get to the end of the chapter in this lesson, but Stephen's speech will also end with the glory of God. He starts with it here in verse 2, but when we get to verse 55, it says, "But being full of the Holy Spirit, he," or Stephen, "gazed intently into heaven and saw the glory of God, Jesus standing at the right hand of God." So Stephen's desire here is to connect himself with God's promises of the past and the roots of Israel's existence. This is not the language of a break with God, God's promise in Israel. It's the exact opposite. Stephen's being accused of, not adhering to all of this history, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Stephen contends, if you will, for the true hope of Israel. After mentioning the God of glory, Stephen starts at the beginning of the nation of Israel, specifically with a call of Abraham. And again, he's going to cover a lot of centuries here of history before he's done. But here in verse 2 and verse 3, we find Stephen quoting from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 4. Verse 2 of Acts 7 says, he says, "Hear me, brethren and fathers, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he lived in Haran, and said to him, Leave your country and your relatives and come into the land that I will show you. Then he left the land of the Chaldeans and settled in Haran. From there, after his father died, God had him move to this country in which you are now living." So once again, you've got this quote from Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, the very beginning, the foundations of the nation that God would build through him. And of course, this act of Abraham was a great act of faith. He's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8. It says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." So again, Abraham would be something very well familiar to this high priest, as well as those who were causing trouble for Stephen. All right, let's pick up in verse 5 of Acts 7. Acts 7, verse 5 says, "But he," or God, "gave him," or Abraham, "no inheritance in it, not even a foot of ground. And yet, even when he had no child, he promised that he would give it to him as a possession and to his descendants after him." So once Abraham arrived in the land where the Jews later lived, no inheritance was given. Right? First foray, and again, all of the possession of the land of Israel by the nation of Israel was going to come a long time after Abraham lived and died. Abraham didn't receive the inheritance that was part of the promise God made to him. Abraham merely receives a promise that is repeated in different forms in places like Genesis 12, 13, 15, 17, 24, and 48. In all those chapters, that promise of God to Abraham is emphasized. The wording of the allusion here in verse 5 of Acts 7 is closest to Genesis 48. I believe about verse 4 is where that comes into play. Again, the point being here, Stephen's making, is that all this took place before Abraham had any children, this promise of descendants who would receive the inheritance. The key to the promise, of course, is that it applies to Abraham's seed or descendants. It was made before Abraham knew he would have descendants. This promise is something that Paul discusses in Romans chapter 4, verses 18 through 22, and Galatians chapters 3 and 4. And of course, we know in those texts that ultimately this seed of Abraham is Jesus himself. There is a sense, though, that there is a plural reference in the idea that every person of faith is a child of Abraham. In fact, we read that in Galatians 3, verses 28 and 29. There, Paul says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man, there is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's descendants, heirs according to the promise. So although Christ is the seed of Abraham. If we belong to Christ, then we share in the promises made. All right, verses 6 and 7. Acts 7, verses 6 and 7. It says, "But God spoke to this effect, that his descendants would be aliens in a foreign land, and they would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years, and whatever nation to which they will be in bondage, I myself will judge, said God. And after that, they will come out and serve me in this place." So God, again, Stephen's reminding these people who should know their history, God promised that it would be some time before the nation received the land. In fact, suffering and slavery were predicted for these descendants of Abraham for a period of 400 years. The language used here in verses 6 and 7 of Acts 7 is from Genesis chapter 15, verses 13 and 14. You may note that Exodus 12, verse 40 says that the sojourn was 430 years. In fact, that's the number Paul uses in Galatians 3:17. The harmonization here between the 400 and 430 would be likely just simply the fact that here in Acts it's just a rounded number. The literal number was 430, but Stephen here is just using a rounded number. The reference to being foreigners in a land that is not their own indicates that Abraham's sojourn would be matched by the nation. The descendants would be enslaved and treated poorly. The remarks foretell the period when the nation was plunged into harsh slavery in Egypt, only to be delivered by Moses in the Exodus as a result of the plague. We're going to get to that here in Stephen's lesson before it's done. But here, Stephen's portrayal shows God's initiative and grace with Israel's people in caring for them and releasing them, as well as consistently delivering them and keeping his promises. God has made Israel, the nation, his special people, and led them to worship him. Again, Stephen is no blasphemer. He's over and over again here in his response, respecting God's promises and sovereign leading of his people. He's making it clear. All right, verse 8, Acts chapter 7, verse 8. "And he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob of the 12 patriarchs." God initiated a special relationship with Abraham that is connected to the giving of the covenant of circumcision. Circumcision, if you will, was a sign of the covenant agreement God made between himself and his people. Tied to the promise to Abraham, circumcision predates the Mosaic law. It was seen as a covenant sign. You can read about that in Genesis 17, verses 10 through 12. Let me read that for you. It says, God says, "This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money or from any foreigner who is not your descendants." And again, the point being here that the eldest patriarchs were obedient in observing this practice, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all carried on with those covenant stipulations. Abraham circumcised Isaac, that's in Genesis 21:4, and then with Jacob came the 12 patriarchs, and their stories in Genesis 21 through 36. God, again, is Stephen's point is God is keeping his promise of a seed. Stephen is making the point that he knows and respects the history of the people and the law. All right, verses 9 and 10. "The patriarchs became jealous of Joseph and sold him into Egypt. Yet God was with him and rescued him from all his afflictions and granted him favor and wisdom in the sight of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and made him governor over Egypt and all his household." So Stephen moves from Abraham to the 12 patriarchs, and especially here, one of the 12, the son Joseph, in verses 9 through 16 of this particular lesson from Stephen. The scene raised is the first hint of trouble as the brothers were jealous of Joseph. That's in Genesis 37. Their jealousy, of course, led them to sell Joseph into slavery into Egypt, but God's sovereign protection overruled this evil, malicious act. The phrase here, as it says in verse 9, that God was with him, means that although Joseph was placed in terrible circumstances, God was protecting him. Luke in Acts 10:38 states that God was with Jesus as he went about doing good and healing. And later in Acts chapter 14, verse 27, the idea is used describing the activity of Paul and Barnabas, where it states that God was with them. Again, God doesn't abandon those through whom he's working, even in difficult circumstances. I believe that the contrast here is truly important. God was with the one whom the other 11 sons of Jacob rejected. And it's highlighting really a note introducing the nation's pattern of failure to recognize the one chosen by God. Ultimately, that's where Stephen's heading in this lesson, to convict the Jewish leaders of what they were doing with Jesus, or had done with Jesus. This pattern began even among those who were responsible for Israel's name, the Patriarchs, and for its being known as a people of 12 tribes. The additional note of jealousy as the cause for Joseph's brothers' actions is raised here, and perhaps such jealousy is also implied in their reaction against Jesus, right? So perhaps that's part of what's going on behind the scenes in Stephen's thinking. All right, verse 11 says, now a famine came over all Egypt and Canaan, and a great affliction with it. Our fathers could find no food. So the situation seemed very dire for the ancestors of Israel when a famine hit both Egypt and Canaan. Jacob and his sons had no food. That God had strategically, though, placed Joseph despite his brother's earlier rejection of him. Joseph was in Egypt, and again, God was looking ahead and providing for the rescue of Israel. It shows God's care and faithfulness to the nation, even in their time of struggle. Verses 12 and 13, Acts 7:12 and 13 says, but when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent our fathers there the first time. On the second visit, Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and Joseph's family was disclosed to Pharaoh. So Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt and sent his sons to obtain some. That's in Genesis 41, verse 57, and Genesis 42, verse 2. After the first visit, Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him, no doubt assuming that Joseph had already died, right? They'd sold Joseph into slavery and probably thought he was long gone. And once again, perhaps this evokes a theme of ignorance in the parallel with Jesus, right? On the second visit, though, to Egypt to obtain grain, Joseph makes himself known to his brothers and reveals his exalted position. And Pharaoh as well came to know Joseph's family. God protected Jacob and his sons despite the latter's rejecting God's messenger and leaving him for dead. A reconciliation resulted, and history shows God's grace to Israel and God's constant effort to reach out to the nation. So you're seeing this recurring theme throughout Stephen's speech. God provides, God takes care of those whom the nation even rejects. Verses 14 and 15 says, then Joseph sent word and invited Jacob, his father, and all his relatives to come to him, 75 persons in all. And Jacob went down to Egypt, and there he and our fathers died. So the overview of Joseph here, Joseph's part of this story, concludes with his call to bring Jacob, his father, and the rest of his family to Egypt, where they were protected by Joseph's relationship to Pharaoh. 75 souls in all came to this alien land. Of course, tradition has various ways of rendering the exact number, and these differences have existed for a long time. So it's hard to know which number was original. The number 75 reflects the Septuagint reading. The Masoretic text has 70, and again, there's various ways to explain the descriptions to see there, and you can search the internet and find that discussion if you will. But either way, the important part here is the rescue of God's people. Verse 16, Acts 7:16 says, from there they removed to Shechem they were removed to Shechem and laid in the tomb which Abraham had purchased for a sum of money from the sons of Hamor in Shechem. So the story of Jacob and his sons ends with their burial. There is a difference in the burial traditions as well. Genesis 49, verses 29 through 32, and Genesis 50, verse 13. In those verses, Jacob is buried near Machpelah, near Hebron, the site Abraham had purchased from Ephron the Hittite in Genesis 23. Joseph was buried at Shechem, according to Joshua chapter 24, verse 32, on land purchased by Jacob from the sons of Hamor. That's what Stephen here is referencing. That's Genesis 33, verses 18 through 20. And once again, there's various ways to harmonize all of that. But Stephen's main point here, it seems, is that the burial took place in the promised land, right? The bones of the patriarchs didn't remain in the land of slavery. It was, again, a move. The move was an act of faith that God would keep his word. Patriarchs clinging to that promise, first of all, made to Abraham. Verse 17, but as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt. So Stephen's review here of Jewish history gives a clear testimony to God's faithfulness and sovereignty. Despite the continued failures of his chosen people and the swirling world events, God was working out his plan. The story moves on at this point to Moses by noting the growth of Jacob's Jacob's descendants in Egypt as the arrival of the promise's fulfillment about land drew near. And I would note that the seed promise by this point had already been realized. The growth of the nation in Egypt had been spectacular. So Abraham's descendants had numerically exploded, and we have yet to have this fulfillment of the land promise. Verse 18 and 19 says, until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. It was he who took shrewd advantage of our race and mistreated our fathers so that they would expose their infants and they would not survive. Stephen here recounts the events of the story of Moses in Israel, and he's going to keep talking about it till we get to verse 44. Stephen begins by citing Exodus chapter 1, verse 8. That passage speaks of a Pharaoh or a king who did not know Joseph and of Egypt hardening its heart against the nation of Israel. There was a close relationship between Joseph and an earlier Pharaoh, but things had fallen apart by this time. This Pharaoh did evil to the Jews and devised a crafty plan to bring about the end of their race. Read about that in Exodus 1, verses 10, 11, Exodus 1, verses 18 and 22 as well. Hebrew parents were commanded to leave their boy infants exposed so that they would die. Verses 20 and 21. It was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely in the sight of God, and he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. After he had been set outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own son, rather. So Stephen's recital of the story of Moses is going to be revealed in 3 parts, covering 40 years each. First of all, his birth and years in Pharaoh's house or court, verses 20 through 22. Then the next 40-year period would be his flight from Egypt and his sojourn in Midian, verses 23 through 29. Finally, his divine commissioning at Sinai and wandering in the wilderness, verses 30 through 43. We won't get that far today, but that kind of breaks down this part of Stephen's story. Stephen now relates the story of Exodus chapter 2, verses 2 through 10. Birth of Moses. Moses was born, as the text says here, as a lovely child in the sight of God, but he was exposed after 3 months of care at his own home, only to be rescued and carried away by Pharaoh's daughter to be a son in her home. The term often translated as lovely, as it is here in the New American Standard, or beautiful, maybe in your translation, I don't think so much refers to looks as it does to purpose. This loveliness was in the sight of God. And so here, I think it's speaking of Moses was well formed or had a favored status with God for the purpose that God had for him in rescuing his people. Verse 22, Acts 7:22. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. So the deliverer Moses here received an education that was the best Egypt could offer, including access to all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which was great at this time. Moses thus became mighty in word and deed. So Moses providentially was equipped very well and trained to be a leader. Again, this is by God's design. The fact that Moses was mighty in word and deed suggests that beyond this education, God was working through him. And Moses was going to be that deliverer that God had in mind. Verse 23 says, but when he, or Moses, was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. So in this second block of 40 years of Moses' life, Stephen speaks of his visit to his brethren, the sons of Israel. This recalls Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 13. Notice what happens when Moses intervenes. Verse 24 says, and when he, or Moses, saw one of the Hebrews being treated unjustly or unrighteously, he defended him and took vengeance for the oppression by striking down the Egyptian. So the incident here begins with an Egyptian attacking or striking a Hebrew, and Moses acts in vengeance on behalf of the Hebrew and comes to his defense. When the New American Standard here says when he defended him and took vengeance, the idea, of course, is that Moses was righting an injustice or exacting a retribution. Moses killed the man and buried his body in the sand so that the Egyptians might not know about the slaying. Verse 25 says, Moses supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. So apparently Moses thought that those observing the act would understand that God had given salvation or deliverance through his hands. The Jews of Moses' time, however, lacked understanding about a divine call to Moses. Here's the beginning of a charge from Luke that the fathers missed their deliverer and failed to understand what God was doing. I think that's part of what Stephen is getting at here. Moses presents himself to his brethren, and they reject him. By the time we get to the end of chapter 7 in verse 52, he gets to crunch time in his sermon, the time that's going to get him stoned to death. But Stephen makes this statement. Acts 7:52 says, which one of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? They killed those who had previously announced the coming of the righteous one, whose betrayers and murderers you have now become. And so Stephen's placing them in a long line of people that rejected God's messengers. Acts chapter 7, verse 26 says, on the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, men, you're brethren, why do you injure one another? So the attention now turns to the next day, the day after Moses struck the Egyptian dead. Two Hebrews are now found fighting, and Moses seeks to reconcile them in peace. The contrast with Moses' defense of one Hebrew against an Egyptian in the previous incident is striking. What's implied is that the Jews should be reconciled to one another. He even asked them why they were acting unrighteously. The version translates it, they're injuring one another, but literally, the Hebrew is, why are you acting unrighteously toward each other? That echoes the act of the Egyptian back in chapter 7, verse 24. The Egyptian was treating a Hebrew unjustly or unrighteously. Verse 27 and 28, but the one who was injuring his brother, or neighbor rather, pushed him away, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you? So Moses' effort here, however sincere, is met with resistance from the man who was wronging his brother. The unrighteous man rejected or thrust aside Moses' attempt with a rebuke. The man asked who appointed Moses to be an arbiter in this battle or fight. Anyone reading Stephen's summary here of Moses' life would know that God had protected and prepared Moses But this man didn't see it and reacted against God's chosen one, a pattern of response that Stephen is getting at here, pointing out. Although not explicitly stated here, these two roles parallel those God had for a later selected leader, and that's Jesus himself. Acts chapter 7, verses 35 through 37. We won't get there today, but next time we'll see that those verses suggest a link between Moses and Jesus. The same combination of ruler and judge appears there, with the mention of Moses' promise to raise up a prophet like him. The promise is an allusion here in these verses to Deuteronomy 8:15. And then, of course, Peter makes the point about Jesus in Acts chapter 3 and verse 22. Verse 29 of Acts 7 says, "At this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of two sons." So the rebuke causes Moses to run for his life to Midian. The word's going to get out to the Egyptians anyway. It says, "So like his fathers before him, Moses becomes a sojourner for a time." The locale follows Exodus chapter 2, verse 15, except that in the original text, the additional note is made that Pharaoh was seeking to kill Moses for his act against the Egyptian was well known. Let me read Exodus 2, verses 14 and 15. These quotes from Stephen are coming from there, but it says, "But he said, 'Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?' Then Moses was afraid and said, 'Surely the matter has become known.' When Pharaoh heard of this matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well." So Moses fled, and again, Stephen's not going to talk about a lot of this intervening history, but Moses flees Egypt, marries, has two sons, Gershon and Eleazar, Exodus 2, verse 22, and Exodus 18, verses 3 and 4. And we're going to stop at this point. It's about halfway through the chapter. We've still got verses 30 through 60, I believe it is, to cover next time, and that'll be too much for this particular lesson. So Lord willing, next time we'll pick up in Acts chapter 7, verse 30, and continue the story of Moses as Stephen works toward the pinnacle of his defense here. Again, he's going to, as we've kind of hinted out several times through this, he's reaching a point saying that the Jewish leaders of his day in opposing him, as well as Jesus and the apostles, they're just following in a long line of Israelite history where some people in Israel were opposing those that God sent to deliver them. And that, again, is what's going to get Stephen stoned to death. So we'll take that up when we get to that point. God bless, and continue your studies.